Thank you, Louisa. I apologize for giving my talk in English. My Spanish is much worse than my English. So, you'll be happy. So the panel, we were asked to talk about these, there we go, these 5 questions. What are the major challenges faced by your city in addressing air pollution and climate change? Well, in the U.S., the problem is obvious. It's political will. So on a national level, you may have heard the news that, boy, air pollutant emission controls are being rolled back. The Clean Power Plan that was to be implemented has been put on hold. Other vehicle emission standards are being at least attempted to roll back. The Paris Climate Accord, the U.S. is in the process of withdrawing from. So the challenges are clear. There's just, at least at this stage, the political will is absent in the U.S. to address these issues. There were 2 questions on the role of science and technology. Boy, I think we have the science and technology well in hand to know what we ought to be doing. It's a question of whether we do that or not. So the 2 questions I'll try and talk about are, what were the steps taken by the city government in reducing the emissions, both air pollutants and greenhouse gases? I'll focus more on greenhouse gases. In general, in the U.S., it's the national government that establishes policy through the Clean Air Act, and it's the states that have to institute these national standards. There's some exceptions. California is the one notable exception of a state that can have policies that can be more stringent than the U.S. policies. Cities, boy, the cities have not had much of a role in the past, but now cities are, in a response to the national change, are beginning to develop their own programs. And I'll talk a little bit about this. And then what are the lessons learned? Well, the lessons learned is basically that ignoring climate change, it does have social and economic consequences. And we'll look at that as we go along. So what are the steps taken by the city government? Well, we'll do one state. There's one state that has developed its own program. And it's a pretty successful program, California. So California passed Assembly Bill 32, which was the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2006. And it was pretty ambitious. It required passed a law that required a sharp reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And the initial requirement was a get back to 1990 levels by 2020. And so that was about a 15% reduction below that expected as business as usual. So that was achieved. In fact, it was achieved 4 years before the target year of 2020. So that was a significant achievement. There's also a requirement of an 80% reduction by 2050. Much more ambitious goal. We'll see if that is achieved. Another thing about this Assembly Bill 32 is it included all the major greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide. So it addressed the methane, nitrous oxide, HFCs, perfluorocarbons, SF6, and nitrogen trifluoride, which I hadn't realized was an important greenhouse gas. The interesting thing is California has instituted a cap and trade program, so for carbon emissions. So that's an up and going program now in California. And so there is a lot of effort to reduce these greenhouse gases through economic incentives. And I've included down here some of the resources, at least, that give more information about these about these programs. So that's California. I said that the goal was met 4 years before the target. In that time, the economy grew by 26%. So the argument against the California program was, boy, it would depress the economy. That has not been the experience in California. California's economy is one of the strongest in any of the states in the United States. So it's and that's been the case of environmental regulations in the U.S. for decades. It's always argued that it will cost jobs and will depress the economy. That never happens in our experience so far. California has come up with a new goal, and that's to get the greenhouse gas emissions 40% below the 1990 levels by 2030. And so that's, they were feeling more ambitious to institute that. And they've also now passed a new bill that requires 100% of the state's electricity to come from carbon-free sources by the end of 2045. So as one of the air pollution controls, particularly in the Los Angeles area, was to move coal-generating power plants to other states and then transmit that energy into the South Coast Air Basin. Now California would phase out that coal-fired electricity generation by 2045. It'll be interesting to see if that can be achieved. Cities do develop their own programs. Okay, besides California, New York City has been active in developing a program. So in Plan New NYC was a 2007 effort instituted by the mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, back in that time. And the goal was to prepare the city for a variety of issues: 1 million more residents, strengthen the economy, and combat climate change, as well as enhancing the quality of life for all New Yorkers. One problem with states is that the mayor, or with cities, is that one mayor leaves and a new mayor comes in. Fortunately, the new mayor, de Blasio, has continued this program under a new name, One NYC, but has pushing much of the same goals. Reduce New York City's carbon emissions by 30% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And there's, besides just being a program that's announced and publicized, there really has been progress made in New York City. A lot of the conversion of power generation has been from coal to natural gas. Now, they claim credit for that, but that's also driven by the economics of natural gas being cheaper than coal, at least at present. There's been an effort to retrofit the buildings in New York City to make them more energy efficient. And they're working to design low energy intensive buildings, both the skyscrapers and smaller residential buildings. So this is a program that's going on that New York City has developed. Beyond that, the programs are much more diffuse. You may be aware of the C40 Cities program. That's around a global program. So they're leading the way towards a healthier and more sustainable future, particularly addressing climate change. Cities that have signed on to that are more than 90 of the world's largest cities, representing 650 million people and something like 1/4 of the global economy. The cities in the U.S. that have joined this program are listed here. The largest cities that you can think of, even Houston, one Texas city, is involved. Texas we look at as a state that is much more Wild West sort of involved in all economic and cultural issues that don't pay much attention to environmental issues in Texas to some extent. So it's encouraging that we have at least one Texas city signed on here. It's a general program that applies internationally. Another general program, international program, is I forgot to put the title of this program on here, but it's down here at the bottom, Under 2 Coalition. So it's a program to try and keep climate change, the increase in temperature less than 2 degrees. And this is a large group of state and regional governments, something like 220 governments representing over 1.3 billion people, 43% of the global economy. But when you look at the US, the West Coast is represented, some of the East Coast is represented, and then a few states scattered throughout the country, but much of the rest of the country is missing from this program. So there's a large push to ignore the issues of climate change. But the lessons that are learned is that the lessons have been taught but have not been learned. They're largely ignored. I used to work with the federal government, with NOAA, and many of the federal agencies are mandated to remove climate change from websites, remove anything mentioning changing climate from any consideration. So it's a discouraging development. But climate change is real. It does happen. Let's see if I can get back to where I'm supposed to be here. Yes. So Hurricane Harvey, perhaps appropriate that it came through Texas. It was a large hurricane that stalled over the Houston area. More than 1 meter of water fell in just a 2 to 3 day period. And so research people have been modeling this, and this suggests that the human influence increased the rainfall by at least 15 to 19%. So there's scientific studies now that are showing that climate change is not something that we've got to worry about in the future, but are really happening right now. So these are 2 independent studies that were presented at the fall AGU meeting in this past December. Another hurricane that came through was Hurricane Florence, just about a month ago. And while the hurricane was being forecast, a group at the University of New York in Stony Brook did a forecast with current conditions and did another modified forecast assuming conditions before the climate had warmed. And they find quite a large effect, that the storm was about 80% bigger than would have been forecast in the absence of climate change, about 80% bigger, 80 kilometers bigger, and that the heaviest rainfall was 50% greater than it would have been without the warming climate. So boy, now we're beginning to get quite large effects from the warming climate, at least in some situations. Well, the other lesson is that climate change impacts increase social injustice. It's not everybody that shares the burden equally. Hurricane Harvey in Houston that I mentioned, that dumped more than 1 meter of water on Houston, Texas. It was primarily the most vulnerable people, the poor communities of color living in segregated neighborhoods that typically are more affordable. They're more affordable because they're built where the flooding risk is much higher. So this was especially true in Houston, where housing developments were built in areas that were designed to be reservoirs during flood season. So much of the flooding occurred in these situations where it was expected that water would accumulate. And this is not a short problem. A year later, the higher income areas have made progress in recovering. The lower income areas are making much less progress and having a much harder time. And then the same is true for Hurricane Florence. It passed over, this is a map of the poverty rate. So the higher, the darker colors are areas with a greater poverty rate. Poor people in the path of a hurricane, much less likely to evacuate. Because how do you go if you don't have a car and if you can't afford to evacuate and stay somewhere else for the days or weeks that it takes you to get back in your home? So communities with financial struggles are slow to rebuild after a major disaster, and that's occurring in the Carolinas where the Hurricane Florence came ashore. And so I think I'll put us back on time here because that's my last slide. Thank you.